In the last year, Fnaf has been releasing a new series of novellas called Tales from the Pizzaplex, which, to this point, seem to be a relatively lore-light, security breach-themed spiritual successor to the previous Fazbear Frights books. However, in the last 6 months, the amount of lore revealed in these books has suddenly increased exponentially. And now, the information from the latest installment and leaked next installment of this series have potentially just shaken Fnaf to its very core once again, and the implications here are massive. So, here's a rundown of the latest revelations from the Tales stories, and why I truly think that these new books have now twisted the Fnaf canon as we know it into something far, far worse. The first few Tales from the Pizzaplex books start off with what is pretty standard Fnaf book fare at this point, with some rather silly, creepy stories with some minor connections to, well, the Pizzaplex. And in the first few stories, we get to see what seems to be a unique book universe Pizzaplex, full of attractions unique to each story that we don't see in-game, like an AR booth and under construction, climbing tubes and haps, a role-playing section in pressure, and a roller coaster. Judging by the emphasis on set attractions and the rather high concept storytelling throughout these stories, it seems that the books are each hammering in that each of the stories of the Tales series, pretty unsurprisingly, kinda take place in their own little separate universes from each other. Again, pretty standard Fnaf book fare at this point. However, then in the second Tales book, Haps, the story Help Wanted pops up. This story follows a failed game developer named Steve, and seems to be this sort of fictionalized biography for Scott Cawthon himself. Full video on that later. But anyways, the real meat of this story is, this man goes from a nobody mopping gas station bathrooms to suddenly being contacted by Fazbear Entertainment to create some indie horror games based off of urban legends around Freddy Fazbear's, all in order to make light of their tragedy. Sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? But long story short, in the story, he eventually does exactly that. Now, this story is odd, to say the least, because while the story gives a very not subtle origin story to the in-universe Fnaf games in the Security Breach universe, and the backstory behind their developer, it also includes, in very Fnaf book fashion, some downright wild elements to it, where apparently Steve has been kidnapped by Fazbear Entertainment and given his dream wife and kids, who are really just staff bots seemingly made real by an illusion disc. And this illusion disc is also used to give him horrible waking nightmares that he uses as inspiration for the Fnaf games he's working on. Again, it seems to be a fictionalized Scott biography. But still, the choice to make such a blatant origin story for the game Help Wanted really raised some eyebrows in the community. But whatever. Since the story has such crazy elements to it, we all assumed it was just a very close parallel to the games, similar to the Fazbear Frights story What We Found, and the like. Nothing too special here, right? But then, in the third book, Somnophobia, we get the interesting story of Clitophobia, which describes a Pizzaplex as we see it in the game Security Breach. But with the new attractions we've seen in the previous Tales stories, we see Haps from the story Haps, we see the climbing tubes he lives in, we see the AR booth from the story Under Construction from Lally's game, we see the role-playing room from Pressure, you name it. And there is this weird emphasis put on all these elements in the story, as if it is trying to tell us that all the Tales books take place in the same universe. Interesting. But then, it goes further. Oh, so much further. With the Bobbiedots Part 1, we not only get one of the best written Fnaf novellas yet, we get a story in the Tales Pizzaplex that puts a near excruciating amount of emphasis on the aspects of that in-universe Pizzaplex that are the same as the one we see in Security Breach. The Bobbiedots story follows a homeless Pizzaplex employee named Abe and his misadventures with some experimental smart home type quality of life holograms called the Bobbiedots after he gets a promotion in the company and sneaks in to live in the condo which the Bobbiedots are being tested in. So far it seems like a pretty normal tale story, right? But spliced in between the main plot are these weird B-plot interruptions of him just living his life working at the Pizzaplex. We get an exact, painfully game-accurate account of the precise route he takes between his sleeping spot and the Pizzaplex, and how he dodges the cameras to get to the bathroom in the Fazpad each morning to get ready for work. We later see him teaching a new employee how to care for DJ Music Man, with Music Man being described in painstaking detail to show that he is identical to the one we see in the game. And we even get an explanation for Music Man's, quote, bouncer mode that we see in the messages in Security Breach, albeit a very lazy one unfortunately. And we get an explanation for why there are so many breakers conveniently spread throughout the arcade. Hell, we even get a scene where the new employee is in the bathroom setting off a breaker when suddenly DJ Music Man reaches in and grabs him, exactly like we see in Security Breach. It's odd, to say the least. And then the story suddenly regains focus and focuses back on the Bobbiedots again. Then a little while later in the story, the exact same thing happens, but with Abe playing a game of Fazbear Blast. Again, in perfect game accurate detail. But then later still, we get a B-plot interruption with Moondrop. Again, Abe is training the newer employee, and we get some really crappy explanations for why the generators are in the play places in the daycare, and why the daycare attendant even has an evil side in the first place. And in the story, Moondrop stalks, taunts, and even dances around the protagonist in an identical fashion to how we see it play out in Security Breach, all in strangely excruciating detail, all over again. So, what is this all supposed to mean, exactly? Well, it seems like for once, I and the community at large agree on this. The first few Tales books were intended as clever red herrings, with, as mentioned, stories that seem to take place in their own little separate universes, with Help Wanted being the only story to alert people that something more might be going on here. But the later stories like Clitophobia were there to show us that the Pizzaplex we know from Security Breach, and the one shown in the books, might not be so different after all, showing us that apparently all the Tales stories took place in the same universe. But the final stories, like the Bobbiedots, are there to take it the final step forward, to show us that not only is the Pizzaplex we see in the Frights books no different from our own, but that it actually is our own. And the bombshell here is that the Tales books do, in fact, take place in the Security Breach universe. And the final silver bullet for this theory is the leaked Tales story, GGY, which is directly about the kid behind the high scores in all of the arcade cabinets we see in Security Breach. The story follows a 12-year-old wannabe journalist kid named Tony as he seeks to find out the identity behind the mysterious GGY, the guy behind all the arcade high scores in the Pizzaplex, so he can write about it for his high school's group writing assignment. In the story, he goes around following many leads while dragging his two friends, who both go by their pen names in the story, Rab, who's a new kid at school, and Boots, who's an old friend of Tony's, along for the journey whenever he can. And in the story, we not only get to see a flawless, Security Breach accurate Pizzaplex with all the added Tales attractions and features as before, but we also get to see Tony get some serious leads in his case. In the story, he talks to an employee who thinks GGY is a kid who stole an employee pass off a lazy coworker, and Tony himself follows suit and steals an employee pass to use to look up GGY in the Pizzaplex database as well, only to find out that GGY is somehow using a modified pass and is apparently snuck in at least 3 people into the Pizzaplex with him as well. And as he digs deeper and deeper, the animatronics, especially Glamrock Freddy, begin to watch him more and more closely. Eventually, after receiving some rather ominous messages on some forums he's been on about his search, Tony meets up with a proficient hacker at his school who has, quite magically, been able to hack into the Pizzaplex's animatronics code. And she found out that GGY has hacked into the animatronics code as well, and has added in a set of inputs to, quote, control the animatronics in very specific ways. And later that day, news breaks that Tony's school counselor, Mary, has gone missing. And Tony remembers the name of one of the people who GGY snuck into the Pizzaplex, Mary. And after a bit of digging, he finds out that all the names for the people GGY snuck into the Pizzaplex were also names of recently missing counselors from his school. Yup, this story is about the tapes we see in Security Breach, and most importantly, the murderous Patient 46. And after that, Tony finds out that his group partner, Rab, has, rather suspiciously, redacted Tony's investigative journalism piece on the topic into a silly fantasy story about wizards and aliens. So, understandably, Tony rather angrily confronts Rab about this, and for the first time in the story, he calls Rab by his real name, Gregory. And then, in a tense moment, a rather angry but oddly restrained Gregory ponders for a moment on how to respond to Tony's anger. And then, after a rather creepy stare down, he decides to finally address Tony by inviting him to the Pizzaplex, telling him that, quote, there are some people I want you to meet there. And then the story ends. Yup, we just got a story explaining that Gregory is Patient 46, not a parallel, not a set of stories with vague similarities to events in the game canon, a straightforward, in-universe story that takes place before the game we play. Wow. And once more, it seems the community has come to a pretty unanimous conclusion here. This story, and most likely all of the story from the Tales books, once again take place in the exact same universe as Security Breach, the game, with story-specific details like the AR booth and climbing tubes either missing in the final game for gameplay or story purposes, or unfortunately were cut out along with like a third of the map in the final release for Security Breach. So, the Pizzaplex books are in the same universe as Security Breach. Awesome, right? Game canon Fnaf books is something we have all been clamoring for ages now, but there are some big problems a canon Tales from the Pizzaplex / Security Breach shared universe creates, and we'll get into those in a minute. But not only that, but it doesn't stop there. Because while the Tales books seem to be in a separate canon from the Fazbear Frights books, there is one very important link that seems to connect the two. Eleanor. Yup, in the very first Tale story Frailty, we get to see what is obviously another Eleanor victim, a girl named Jessica, whose body was replaced with junk and held together with a moon-shaped necklace in the story. And in the later story Animatronic Apocalypse, we see a malicious school principal who seems to have been replaced by somebody else we know. And now, very little people realize, but Eleanor is the main antagonist of the Fazbear Frights story. She not only appeared in To Be Beautiful, but is also revealed in the Stitch Ray Stingers that she's the one who gave the plush trap chaser its human eyes and teeth. She's the one torturing Delilah in the story 1:35 AM, as well as holding Pete down and Step Closer, pushing Sam into the train in Blackbird, manifesting as Shadow Bonnie in Hide and Seek, and last but not least, she was the greater evil seen inside William Afton in the story The Man in Room 1280. And she plays a massive role in the finale of the Stitch Ray stories, which just so happened to hint that her story might not be over. So, in a nutshell, Eleanor is Fazbear Frights. She is responsible for the majority of the events we see in that book series, and probably many more than I just mentioned. And now, it seems like she is back in Tales from the Pizzaplex. So, what does this all mean exactly? Well, I've seen many in the community take it to mean that most, if not all of Fazbear Frights is canon to the Security Breach universe as well. And as crazy as it sounds, the evidence is growing to support that theory. And keep in mind, the next section of this video is going to sound pretty insane, but trust me, you'll understand why I go that far in my speculation pretty soon. And I promise I'll bring it all back at the end. But going back to the earlier point, the new Tales books very clearly establish that there are many different Freddy Fazbear spin-off / franchisees that we didn't know about. Like in the story Submechaphobia, which focuses on a privately owned aquarium-themed Freddy's location that somehow survived the franchise's closure. Yeah, it's dumb, I know. But unlike in the previous Fnaf novel trilogy, which is very clearly an alternate universe take or a what-if for the story we see in the classic Fnaf games, Fazbear Frights does very little to directly contradict the game lore as we know it. In the Fazbear Frights stories, it can be presumed that much, if not all of the events of the classic Fnaf games actually happened in the way that it did in the game canon, in the main Fright stories canon as well. In particular, the ones with Eleanor in them. In those stories, we see many of the Freddy's locations as we know them from the games, and judging from the story The Man in Room 1280, it's pretty much confirmed that the events of FNAF 6 happened in Fazbear Frights as well. Mostly the same, if not identical, to how it happened in the games. And again, we are missing a lot of the hard contradictions like we saw in the previous novel trilogy, like the sister location and FNAF 2 locations not really existing, at least as their own separate things. Mangle being a mutilated Funtime Foxy, Circus Baby being a rebuilt Charlie, and Afton having a completely different arc and death in those books. But in the Eleanor-based Fazbear Frights stories, the only major contradictions seem to really revolve around a kid named Andrew being the vengeful spirit instead of Cassidy, and Eleanor looking a whole lot like Circus Baby for some reason. And yet, Eleanor really seems to be in the FNAF timeline. And now, there's a massive discussion rippling through the FNAF community about whether we are even right about Cassidy being the vengeful spirit in the first place. But regardless of that last point is true or not, as much evidence as there is for Fazbear Frights existing in the Tales, and therefore in the Security Breach universe, there is still one major problem with all of this, and that's the arcade cabinets we see in Security Breach, many of which depict characters from the Fazbear Frights series on them. In particular, ones from the Eleanor-based stories. This is a pretty huge hint that, like the classic FNAF games we see referenced in Security Breach and Help Wanted, the Fazbear Frights are a fictional book series that also exists in the Security Breach timeline, created by the new Fazbear Entertainment to make light of urban legends based on the franchise. But like I said, the seeming presence of Eleanor in the Tales stories causes some problems with that. But regardless of where exactly the canon of the Fazbear Frights story lie, unless the Tales story of Frailty and animatronic apocalypse are some serious red herrings, then that would imply that there are at least some major truths in the Fazbear Frights stories, especially in regards to the character, Eleanor. But whatever. It seems pretty cool, right? Tales of the Pizzaplex might be this cool continuation of the Fazbear Frights series. But you gotta remember here, like we said, it is almost certain now that the Tales from the Pizzaplex series takes place in the canon game universe of Security Breach. So, that would mean that some, if not most aspects of the Fazbear Frights stories are now canon to the Fnaf Security Breach universe as well. And this has led me to what I think is a quite frightening theory of what's going on behind this all. And so, here's what I think is the worst case scenario for what Scott is trying to accomplish with the books here. You gotta remember, Scott originally made the books as an accessible entry point for newer fans, and also as a rather genius way to teach us about the game universe, with the famous parallels between the two. But now, after a whopping 3 book universes, and now a solid 2 game timelines, the books have arguably done as much damage to the franchise's accessibility as it initially improved. So now, I think with all these previously unconnected universes now growing some serious links between the two, I think that it's at least very possible that Scott is trying to unify the timeline, at least as much as he can. And from a media perspective, this makes perfect sense, really. As, like I said, Fnaf is about as convoluted and newcomer unfriendly as a media franchise can get right now. However, the unfortunate truth is, while unifying the timeline seems like a good idea on paper, in practice, this is about as comically bad as things could get. Because if what I'm postulating is true, and I do mean if, that would mean that, in the official Fnaf canon, there's a supernatural robot demon thing that somehow replaces people's body parts with trash and then steals their old disembodied parts to put back together and possess them, all without anyone, including the dismembered person in question, noticing? There are a bunch of tiny Freddy animatronics who run around pizzerias and steal children's souls and somehow replace it in their old bodies with perfect replications of their old consciousness. There's a Fazbear branded mad scientist kit that contains a pink gel called Fazgoo that will latch onto a person, steal their internal organs, and then grow into a perfect clone of said person and leave the real person's corpse to rot. After the FNAF 6 fire, William Afton's corpse, which, oh by the way, has living organs in it and is still bleeding and breathing even years after the fact, somehow gets possessed by Eleanor, gets destroyed again, then stops the kid from going to heaven, and somehow takes over a trash compactor full of agony-filled parts and grows into this 15-foot tall trash monster with rabbit ears, and goes around infecting everything it touches with agony and assimilating their parts. And so much more. And unfortunately, those are the cream of the crop Fazbear Fright stories as well. And if any of the other Fazbear Fright stories have any truth to them, oh boy. And worse yet, even if my theory about the simplified timeline is wrong, even if there isn't a lick of Fazbear Frights content canon in the Security Breach timeline, from our new revelations from Tales of the Pizzaplex, it still means that every ridiculous story and every awful explanation present in the new Tales books are still canon to the games. This includes the Pizzaplex kidnapping their writers and giving them staff bots as wives and children, magical AR boosts that can perfectly imitate a person's perfect reality and can lock them into flawless illusions of all their family, friends, and surroundings indefinitely. In this universe, magical mind control orbs are sold to children in the ticket booths of the Pizzaplex, ones that can literally create and control dreams from a person while they are awake, and even draw from and alter reality in order to enhance these dreams. The absolutely insane concept of the mind control illusion disc that can somehow create perfect 3-dimensional illusions that fool all 5 of the senses and can make an endoskeleton look, feel, eat, breathe, bleed, and even have completely normal relations with regular humans, all while being completely undetectable by regular people. And not only that, but one disc can also do the same for an indefinite amount of robots, scenery, and hallucinations for a person, all without even really being in close proximity to the person in question. And it just goes on and on. And it seems to all be 100% canon to the games now. People have really been giving these FNAF book stories slack so far, and rightfully so, as, well, these are books, presented as silly Goosebumps-esque what-ifs for FNAF. But just consider for a moment, just pick up a Pizzaplex book and read it as an official canon Fnaf novel, and just take a moment to realize that everything you see in this book is officially canon to the games now. Imagine that you are playing a Fnaf game right now, and all of these stories out are playing out before you. Not as silly children's books, but as actual canon Fnaf storytelling, exactly how it is presented in the books. And now realize, this is exactly what's happening here. This is Fnaf now. Not this, not even this. This, and this. And if even half, no, a quarter of what I just postulated is true, just let that sit there for a moment. And as the main point of this video really, if we are to consider the drastic change in Scott's writing style between the classic Fnaf timeline and the Security Breach timeline, and the fact that now, many, if not most of the Fnaf novellas are canon to that timeline, with the presence of previous book characters in-universe now, to me, that would strongly suggest that the book canon hasn't been canonized to the new game universe, but rather, the main point of rebooting the Fnaf franchise with Help Wanted and Security Breach was to retcon Fnaf into the book canon. Yikes. With Scott wanting to incorporate just about every absurd angle, every downright nonsensical theme and plot point into the games to stay. Gone is the groundbreakingly original story and presentation of the original game series, and along with it, its downright incredible lore and writing. And instead, it's now been replaced by a much lower effort, wubbier sci-fi style of writing that really couldn't be asked to even put any effort into itself most of the time. Hey, you know why there are generators in the play places? Well, because the wall were finished there or something, and they in walls they no work. So up with the children makes sense. And why Music Man? Well he's a bouncer and in a children's arcade, but whatever. But why? Oh well, because Control A and Control D too hard for Fazbear programmers. So he keep murdering people in the restroom. And why purple thing back? Well, it's because he digital copy that got inside a robot body and old parts or something. Yeah, that works. And unfortunately, it's really obvious that this sort of wubbier, lower effort sci-fi fantasy style is what Scott wants to write for the franchise nowadays. Or, at the very least, he finds it to be the most stomachable way he thinks he can continue. And not only that, because despite the overwhelmingly negative feedback to the new approach to the franchise's writing so far, Scott isn't pulling back from that new approach either. No, on the contrary, he's doubling down. And so is Steel Wool. And I know I speak for a lot of people when I say this is pretty damn disappointing for the franchise, because all in all, the writing for the Fnaf novellas like Tales from the Pizzaplex and Fazbear Frights, while it did have some pretty fun moments as a book series, is still pretty awful overall. And even if it has some good moments to it, now, instead of just being silly spin-off children's books, the Pizzaplex books are hard Fnaf canon. I know right now Scott is writing about what he wants to write about, but at this point, it seems like Scott has just really given up with his writing at this point. Not only was Security Breach a disaster on a hard drive when it came to story, but at this point, Scott is just kinda throwing nonsense at the screen with the books. Take for example the other leaked Fazbear Fright story, The Storyteller, which tells us that apparently the glitch trap virus was introduced to the Pizzaplex by means of a flamboyant white tiger animatronic, whose disembodied head was used by Fazbear Entertainment as an AI story generator that was for some reason plugged into every single attraction in the Pizzaplex? What? I'm serious. Tiger Rocco Thee, do not steal. It's okay for Scott to write about what he wants to write about, and do things as he wants to do them. But at this point, all he's doing is continuing to damage a massive franchise that will probably far outlive him. And with his latest decisions, the quality of writing for said franchise just keeps plummeting and plummeting. And as a totally non-fictional wise man once said, you can't write a game universe like you do a silly kids novella. When you do, you get Security Breach. Honestly, Scott just really needs to take a break from Fnaf at this point. It's really obvious he was burned out on this franchise 5 years ago, much less today. He really just needs to let himself breathe for a year or two, then actually work on something he wants to work on. Like maybe finally making a sequel to his masterpiece, The Desolate Hope, like he's been wanting to for a decade. Or maybe just make another silly Legacy of Flan game for him and his kids. Or just something he actually feels passionate about making again. And who knows? Maybe Fnaf is already at a point where he can take a step away from it. Who knows? Maybe Fnaf Plus will be a major hit, and Scott can just hire on Finisum to do much of the story lifting for the foreseeable future. Maybe one of the other games in production, like the Universal multiplayer game, is going to take the franchise to new heights, and he can just give that team the reins, and so on and so forth. But whether or not any of those are the case, I still really think that Scott needs to take a step back and just give it a little rest at this point. Because if there's one thing indie horror needs at this point, it's some genuine passion.
I'm Jumbo Josh.
No, stop! I can't do this anymore, man. I can't do it.
What do you mean, brah?
I mean, we had this whole thing planned out. I was gonna say you copied us. Fendi was gonna come out, get a few laughs, but it just feels like we're going through the motions, you know? The more these indie horror games come out, the more it just feels like the magic is gone.
Brah. Sit on my lap, brah. Come here.
Why are there so many games about mascots with lore that feels rushed and contrived? But that doesn't mean they have no love and passion. They just need to actually try. Let's work together to make a correction and make these games feel more unique. And make sure to play Chapter 3 as soon as it comes out on Steam.